I never thought I'd be the man who got blindsided in his own marriage. My name is Draven Hale, and for 33 years, I devoted myself to Evangeline, my wife, my closest friend, or so I believed. Together, we built a life from scratch. Every milestone, every scar, and every laugh had been part of the fabric of us. I believed that we were past the point of secrets, that at 60, we had grown solid in a way that nothing could tear apart. It was my 60th birthday that changed everything. Evangeline had insisted on hosting a party, saying she wanted to do something memorable for me, like old times. She'd even handled every detail herself, from the guest list to the appetizers and wine. I thought it was sweet, nostalgic even, that she wanted to create something special. So when friends and family started arriving, I allowed myself to relax, even feel a bit proud. We'd made it through years of life's chaos, with 2 grown kids, the usual ups and downs, and a bond that had outlasted most of our friends' marriages. As the night went on, Evangeline was her usual charming self, floating from guest to guest with that graceful, effortless elegance she always had. The kind of poise that never wavered, even when we faced hard times. She looked radiant, in a deep green dress that hugged her figure in a way that seemed to pull all eyes to her. I remember thinking I was lucky. She was still beautiful, still lively. People seemed to notice her more than usual that night, and a few guests even commented to me on her energy, how vibrant she looked. I felt proud, foolishly proud, thinking she had that glow because she was happy to celebrate with me. At some point in the evening, she asked if I'd bring up the bottle of Bordeaux we'd saved for a special occasion. "It's in the cellar, isn't it?" she'd asked with a soft smile, one that somehow felt practiced, rehearsed. But I didn't think much of it. I was eager to play the good host, so I went. The cellar was quiet, and as I took my time to look for the bottle, I thought about everything. The years together, our history. I remember feeling content, grateful even, wondering how we'd made it to this point without losing each other. And I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as I finally found the Bordeaux, dusting off the bottle and heading back upstairs, imagining how pleased she'd be. But when I reached the top of the stairs, that contentment disappeared in an instant. At first, it was just voices. Hushed tones and laughter coming from around the corner, by the hallway leading to the study. Something about it sounded off, a little too private, too familiar. I froze, listening, as one of the voices became clearer, unmistakable. It was Evangeline, laughing in a way I hadn't heard in years. There was something girlish, almost playful about it, like she was letting herself go, revealing a part of herself I hadn't seen in ages. Curiosity and unease pulled me closer. I peeked around the corner, and there they were, Evangeline and Reed, her much younger co-worker. She was pressed up against the wall, his hand resting low on her back, pulling her in as if they were alone, as if they were lovers hiding in plain sight. Her face was tilted up towards his, lips parted in a smile that seemed to burn with excitement. I stood there, helplessly watching as Reed leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, their laughter drifting softly down the hallway, intimate, unrestrained. In that moment, it felt like the ground shifted under me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't look away, couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. I thought of all the moments I'd trusted her, all the years we'd built together. My heart pounded as I felt the jagged edge of betrayal. There was no mistaking the intimacy between them. It was raw, unguarded, the kind of connection that once was ours but now felt like a ghost, haunting the house I thought was still my home. I stood there in silence, feeling myself unravel as I realized what this meant. This wasn't just a careless touch or a misunderstanding. It was a betrayal, and not just of me, but of everything we had built together. I don't remember exactly how long I stood there, gripping that bottle of wine so tightly my knuckles went white. The laughter between them faded as Reed leaned in to whisper something in her ear, his hand brushing back a loose strand of her hair. Evangeline smiled, a coy, almost wicked expression flickering across her face. It was the kind of smile I hadn't seen in years, and somehow, in that moment, it felt like she was a stranger. The worst part wasn't just the sight of them together. It was how obvious it seemed, like they'd done this 100 times before. The way they moved, the way she leaned into him so naturally, it was clear this wasn't some harmless flirtation. It was practiced, familiar. It made me wonder how long this had been going on, and how many other times I'd missed signs like this, too caught up in my own trust to notice what was right in front of me. The wine bottle felt heavy in my hand, and for a moment, a surge of anger made me want to throw it, to make some noise, to demand they explain themselves right then and there. But instead, I found myself retreating, slipping quietly back into the kitchen, away from the sight that was tearing me apart. My heart raced, my hands trembled, and I felt this crushing wave of humiliation, mixed with an anger so intense I could barely see straight. I returned to the party, but everything was blurred now, voices and laughter swirling around me in a haze. I felt like a stranger in my own home, surrounded by people I no longer wanted to see. They were our friends, people who had watched Evangeline and me grow together over the years, who thought we had the perfect marriage. If they had seen what I'd just seen, would they look at her differently? At me, as though I'd been blind? But none of them noticed the turmoil in my face. Not even Evangeline, who eventually rejoined the group as if nothing had happened, glancing at me with that same practiced smile, as though I were just another one of our guests. When our eyes met, I could swear there was a flicker of something in her gaze, maybe a hint of guilt, or maybe just the barest recognition of the secret that hung between us. She didn't know I'd seen them, but it didn't matter. That flicker was enough to tell me she was hiding something. I forced myself to stay calm, to make it through the rest of the evening without losing control. I watched her move around the room, laughing and chatting, touching my shoulder lightly as she passed, the perfect image of a devoted wife. But every small gesture, every touch, every casual word felt like a knife twisting deeper, knowing now that it was all a lie. When the guests finally began to leave, I felt relief that I could finally be alone with my thoughts. But Evangeline's eyes stayed on me as she waved our friends out the door, her gaze lingering a little too long. I wondered if she sensed something was off, or if she was so deeply in her own world that she didn't even notice how cold I'd become. As the last friend stepped out into the night, I closed the door behind them, hearing the quiet settle over the house. The birthday she'd planned so carefully had ended, but all I could feel was the beginning of something darker, something I hadn't prepared for. Evangeline turned to me, her smile now soft, as if she were playing her final act for the night. And I knew, as I looked at her, that I couldn't let this go unaddressed. I wasn't going to sleep another night under the same roof without confronting her. In a calm voice I said, "Let's have a drink," and made my way to the living room, feeling the heavy weight of what was about to unfold. The silence between us hung heavy, broken only by the faint clink of my glass as I set it down. Evangeline watched me with that poised expression she'd perfected over the years, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she was waiting to see how far I'd take this. I could sense her calculating, assessing, probably deciding how much she could still control the situation, even now. I let the quiet stretch on, hoping it would unsettle her, maybe force her to acknowledge what had happened. But she just sat there, sipping her wine with an air of indifference that made me feel like a stranger in my own living room. She looked at me as if I were someone she barely recognized, and in that look, I saw something I hadn't noticed before, almost a flicker of contempt. As if my reaction was inconvenient to her, an interruption to whatever plans she had. I wondered how long she'd been feeling that way, how many moments like this she had hidden behind her calm, perfect smile. Taking a deep breath, I chose my words carefully, letting her know that I had seen everything. I told her I had seen the way she and Reed had been, how they seemed more like lovers than colleagues, how his touch lingered on her, and hers on him, in a way that was far from professional. For the briefest moment, her expression faltered, but she recovered quickly, straightening in her chair, a dismissive look crossing her face. There was something almost theatrical in her response, a casual shrug as she brushed off my words, as though I had simply misunderstood. She called it friendship, described their connection as nothing more than close, insisting it was natural for two people who worked together to have some level of comfort with each other. Her words felt empty, hollow, and the more she spoke, the more I realized that she was simply unwilling to admit anything. She had decided to twist the situation around, framing it as some harmless misunderstanding, as if I were a paranoid fool seeing things that weren't there. There was a calmness to her tone, a sense of control, as though she'd prepared for this moment, ready to deflect, deny, and diminish. And yet, her attempts to minimize the truth only deepened the betrayal. It wasn't just the affair that hurt, it was the way she was willing to twist reality, to rewrite our entire history with a few casual words. She seemed utterly unbothered by what she'd done, more irritated by my reaction than by her own actions. As I listened, I felt my anger transform into something colder, something almost beyond rage. I could see that, to her, I had become a background character in her story. She dismissed everything we had built, everything we had promised each other, with a careless wave of her hand. It was as if our decades together had been nothing more than an inconvenience she'd grown tired of, a role she no longer wanted to play. In that moment, I felt the weight of years pressing down on me, the countless ways I had compromised, given up pieces of myself to keep our life together stable. And for what? To end up here, in my own home, being told by my wife that my loyalty, my love, my trust had all been misplaced. A part of me wanted to keep fighting, to push her to admit the truth. But as I looked at her, sitting there with that distant, almost mocking expression, I realized there was nothing left to fight for. She had made her choice, and so had I. I sat back, letting her words wash over me without resistance, feeling a strange calm settle over my thoughts. She had crossed a line, and there would be no going back. The version of Evangeline I had loved, the one I thought I knew, was gone. And all that was left was this stranger in my living room, a woman who no longer cared about what she had destroyed. As I sat across from her in the dimly lit room, watching her deflect and deny without a hint of remorse, I felt something shift inside me, a kind of resignation mixed with clarity. I realized I wasn't just seeing the truth about her affair. I was seeing the truth about our entire marriage, the way she had slowly drifted from me over the years, bit by bit, until she became this stranger with nothing but indifference in her eyes. I looked around the room, at the familiar furniture, the framed photos on the wall, each one capturing a moment in our lives that now felt distant, even meaningless. There we were, smiling in family photos, standing side by side at holiday gatherings. In each picture, we looked like the perfect couple, devoted, content. And yet, here I was, feeling like I'd been a fool, too blind to see the cracks forming beneath the surface. Evangeline's calmness, her casual dismissal of my pain, revealed something that hurt even more deeply than her betrayal. I realized she didn't fear losing me. She wasn't afraid of the consequences, or of what might happen if the truth came fully into the light. To her, I was already a shadow, someone she had outgrown, someone she no longer cared to keep close. As she continued to talk, her tone grew colder, her words sharper, until they carried an edge that felt almost rehearsed. She began recounting, in a clipped, almost clinical tone, the ways she felt our marriage had grown stale, how she had begun to see me as predictable, uninspired. She said it without emotion, as if she were talking about a stranger. To her, I had become part of a routine she wanted to escape, a life she had moved on from long before I'd noticed. I sat there, absorbing the full weight of her words, feeling a hollowness settle in my chest. Every sentence she spoke, every complaint, every thinly veiled insult, tore through me, erasing the man I thought I had been in her eyes. For years, I believed she saw me as her rock, her partner, her confidant. But here she was, stripping away that image piece by piece, leaving nothing but resentment and disdain. The final blow came when she mentioned Reed again, casually, almost carelessly. She spoke of him as if he were just an ordinary part of her life, a fixture she had the right to include without question. She didn't even bother to hide her admiration for him, the way she described him as exciting and refreshing, the kind of man who had brought out something in her that she thought she'd lost. It was in that moment that I knew there was no saving us. Whatever connection we'd once had, whatever love had once existed between us, was gone. She had buried it long before this night, replaced by a desire for something new, something that had no place for me in it. She had already chosen her path, and I realized that I couldn't follow her down it. As I looked at her, her face still calm, still unmoved, I felt the last of my hope dissolve. There would be no apology, no confession, no regret. This was who she was now. Someone who saw our marriage as a closed chapter, a part of her life she had already left behind. And in that quiet, heart-wrenching moment, I understood what I had to do. I wasn't going to beg, or plead, or fight for a woman who had discarded me so easily. Instead, I felt a cold resolve settle over me, a determination that I hadn't felt in years. I would let her go, but not without taking back the pieces of myself she had taken for granted. After she'd finished speaking, Evangeline leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as if she'd just won an argument. There was a smugness in her eyes, a look that told me she thought she'd put this issue to rest, that her rationalizations would be enough to keep me quiet, obedient. I could feel her watching me, likely waiting for me to say something, maybe even to accept this twisted new reality she'd built. But something had shifted in me. The man she thought she knew, the man who would let himself be overlooked, dismissed and disrespected, that man was gone. In his place, A new resolve took root, a kind of steely calm that allowed me to look at her, not as my wife, but as someone who no longer held any power over me. Without a word, I rose from my chair and took a long, slow look around the room. This was the house we had made a home together, the place where we'd raised our children, shared our lives, and built what I thought was an unbreakable bond. But now, it felt foreign, like I was seeing it all for the first time. Every piece of furniture, every photo, every item I'd once cherished seemed tainted, part of a life that no longer felt real. I could sense Evangeline's gaze on me as I moved through the room. She seemed almost amused by my silence, maybe even triumphant, as if she'd forced me into a corner where I'd have no choice but to accept things on her terms. But as I turned back to her, I saw the faintest flicker of doubt in her eyes, a small, unspoken question about the silence that had stretched between us. She was beginning to realize that I wasn't going to react the way she'd expected. I poured another glass of whiskey, letting the calm wash over me, steadying my hands and my thoughts. I felt no urge to argue or demand answers. I knew that whatever explanation she might offer would be hollow, a performance meant to justify her actions rather than confront the damage she'd done. She had made her choices, and now, I was ready to make mine. Looking back at her, I felt no need to explain myself. Instead, I took my time, letting her see the quiet resolve in my eyes, the certainty that I was no longer under her control. She shifted uncomfortably, her smugness fading slightly, as if she'd finally realized that she'd misjudged me. The confidence she'd worn like a mask began to slip, and for the first time that night, I saw a hint of something else, a flicker of uncertainty, even fear. In a voice I barely recognized as my own, calm and steady, I told her that I was done. Done with her games, her lies, her deceptions. I told her that this was the last time she would ever take me for granted, that she could go ahead and pursue her freedom, but she'd do it without me. The words were simple, clear, and they left no room for argument. Evangeline's expression shifted, surprise breaking through her practiced mask. She hadn't expected this. She'd likely thought I would be too broken, too humiliated, to stand up for myself. But now, faced with the reality that I wasn't going to stay quiet, her confidence faltered. Her eyes darted away, her lips pressing into a thin line, as if she were finally beginning to understand the gravity of her choices. Without waiting for a response, I turned and left the room, feeling a strange, liberating calm settle over me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was reclaiming my life, stepping out of the shadows where she'd kept me, and into a future where I was finally free of her manipulation. I felt the weight of her betrayal lift, replaced by a sense of clarity that told me I would be just fine, even if it meant walking away from everything I'd once held dear. I knew then that my journey was just beginning, that there would be hard days ahead. But I also knew that, whatever lay ahead, it would be on my terms. I was done letting her dictate my life. As I walked down the hallway, away from Evangeline and the life we'd shared, I could feel the cold air of the empty house pressing in around me. For the first time, the place felt hollow, stripped of its warmth and memories, like it had turned into a stage set for a life I no longer belonged in. All those years, those countless days of routine and shared habits, now felt like they dissolved into a fog. What had once been my sanctuary was now just a shell. I found myself in the small study, a room we'd used more for storage than anything else in recent years. The shelves were lined with books we rarely touched, knickknacks from trips we'd taken, pictures of us at various anniversaries, family gatherings, holidays. I'd once found comfort in this space, feeling the pride of a life well lived. But now it all felt like a display, a carefully curated set of artifacts that only hinted at what we'd actually been through, leaving out the truth of where we'd ended up. In the quiet, I let myself think back over the years, trying to piece together where things had gone so wrong. Was there a point when I could have changed things, some moment when I'd missed a sign? Had I been so focused on stability, on creating this life, that I'd overlooked her slow drift away from me? I wondered if I'd been blind or if she had been hiding her true self all along. The answer didn't matter now, but I couldn't help searching for it, combing through memories that now felt distant and foreign. As I sank into an old leather chair, I thought about our children, grown now, with lives of their own. Would they see her differently if they knew? Would they blame me for not holding things together, or would they understand? I hadn't wanted to bring them into this mess, but I knew that eventually, they would find out. The idea of explaining it to them filled me with dread. They'd always seen us as their foundation, a reliable constant. Now, I would be the one left to answer their questions, to explain how things had fallen apart. I looked down at the half-empty glass of whiskey in my hand, feeling the weight of all that was about to change. I knew this wouldn't be a clean break. There were shared finances, property, years of entangled memories and commitments. Even with all my anger and resolve, the practicalities of unraveling a life together would be messy, painful, drawn out in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Yet as I sat there, staring into the amber liquid, a thought began to form. A plan, a path forward that would let me regain some measure of control. I wasn't going to let her simply walk away from this without consequences. The years I had poured into her, into this life, deserved more than quiet resignation. If she wanted a new life so badly, I would give her the freedom she craved, but on my terms, not hers. Taking a long, final sip, I resolved that I would start taking back everything she had taken for granted. I would peel back the layers of comfort she'd wrapped herself in, the security she'd grown accustomed to. She had made her choice, and I would make sure she understood the weight of it. The next morning, the house felt eerily quiet. I woke up early, far earlier than I'd planned, my mind too restless to let me sleep. The events of the night before came rushing back, each memory sharper, more painful, and yet strangely, they fueled a new determination in me. Today would be the first step in taking back control, in showing her that her actions had consequences. I found myself in our walk-in closet, staring at the rows of clothes, shoes, bags, all the things she had collected over the years, symbols of the life we had shared. She had always had a taste for the finer things, investing in designer labels, handbags, and accessories that filled every corner of her space. I'd often shrugged it off, thinking it was harmless, just part of her personality. But now it all seemed to represent something else. Her sense of entitlement, her belief that she could have whatever she wanted, without regard for anyone else. Without overthinking it, I started pulling clothes from their hangers, bags from the shelves. The ritual felt almost therapeutic as I sorted through her things, stripping away layer after layer of the identity she had crafted. One by one, I tossed her dresses, shoes, and scarves into bags, feeling the weight of years of resentment lift with each piece. Once the bags were filled, I called a consignment shop I knew, explaining that I had some items to sell. By noon, I'd loaded the bags into the car, and by mid-afternoon, I was back, feeling lighter, having rid the house of the belongings she had treated like trophies, reminders of the life she had built with her deception. It was only a small act, a small step toward reclaiming my space, but it felt like a beginning. As I went about the day, I started thinking of other ways I could distance myself from her shadow. I went through our financial accounts, making notes of everything I'd contributed, every investment I'd made. For the first time, I took a hard look at the finances she had always managed, the accounts I'd trusted her to handle. I realized how little I'd actually known about our finances, how much I'd let her take control. That would end now. My resolve grew stronger with each passing hour. I thought about the friends we shared, people who had been part of our lives for decades, the people she had charmed with her easy laugh and practiced smile. I decided I wouldn't keep this a secret. They deserved to know the truth, to understand what had really been going on. If she wanted to rebuild her life with Reed, she could do it in the open, with everyone knowing exactly who she was and what she had done. In the late afternoon, I picked up the phone and called a few of our closest friends, casually letting details of her betrayal slip into the conversation. I didn't embellish or exaggerate. I simply stated the truth. There was a surprising sense of release in it, the freedom of no longer having to protect her image or pretend that things were fine. Each call was another piece of my old life being dismantled, but instead of sadness, I felt a growing sense of liberation. By the time evening came, I was exhausted but strangely content. The weight of the last few years felt lighter, and I could finally see a way forward. The house was quieter, emptier without her presence cluttering it, and I began to feel a peace I hadn't felt in years. The house felt strange without all of Evangeline's belongings filling every corner. I expected to feel some sense of loss, a pang of regret, but all I felt was relief, a clearing of the air, like opening a window in a room that had been stifling for years. Each step forward was giving me back a little piece of myself, a self that had been buried under years of compromises I never questioned. With the consignment money and the realization of how much I'd let slip over the years, I decided to open a new bank account in my name only. I knew it was only a small practical step, but it was another layer of protection, another shield against the chaos Evangeline had brought into my life. As I set up the account, A sense of security settled over me. She would no longer have access to everything I had worked for. That night, I couldn't help but reflect on the years we'd spent together, wondering if she'd ever really valued what we had. I thought back to the early days, when I'd been eager to make her happy, to build a life that felt stable, secure. I had overlooked her small deceptions, the things she hid just out of sight, thinking they were inconsequential. I realized now how carefully she had played her role, always leaving just enough mystery to keep me guessing, while keeping her true self hidden beneath the surface. There was a part of me that wanted answers, some explanation that might make sense of it all. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that any answer she might give would only add to the lies. Her reasons would be self-serving, an attempt to rationalize what she'd done without admitting the full extent of her betrayal. She had given herself permission to live two lives, one as my wife and the other as a stranger with Reed, and any answer she offered would be just another layer of deceit. A few days later, I began making subtle changes around the house. I removed the photos of us from the walls, packed away mementos that had once seemed precious. Each small shift made the place feel more like mine, like I was reclaiming not only the house but the memories, deciding what I would keep and what I would leave behind. I wanted the space to reflect who I was now, to remind me that I was moving forward, not staying trapped in the past. I even reached out to a realtor, curious about the idea of selling the house altogether. It was early, I knew, and maybe the idea was premature, but the thought of a fresh start somewhere else, far from the reminders of what had happened, filled me with an unexpected hope. I wasn't sure yet if I'd go through with it, but just knowing I had the option made me feel more in control. As the days passed, I started to see a version of myself that I hadn't glimpsed in years. Stronger, more self-assured. The anger was still there, simmering under the surface, but it was a different kind of anger now, one that drove me forward rather than holding me back. I wasn't simply reacting to what Evangeline had done, I was building something new, a foundation I could stand on without her. By the end of that week, I was no longer haunted by the betrayal or the questions of how things had fallen apart. Instead, I was focused on what came next, on reclaiming the life that I had let slip away. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a strange, quiet sense of peace. The first days of reclaiming my life had been fueled by anger and clarity, each small action feeling like a piece of armor, protecting me from the betrayal. But as the days turned to weeks, I felt the weight of all I was leaving behind begin to settle in. A sense of grief mixed with relief, a complicated knot of emotions that lingered in the quiet of the empty house. One evening, as I was sorting through the last of Evangeline's things, I came across an old photo album tucked away in the back of the closet. It was dusty, as though neither of us had touched it in years. Curious, I flipped it open, finding myself face to face with images from the early days. Photos of vacations, family gatherings, our wedding. I hadn't expected the sting that came with seeing us like that. So young, so sure of each other, unaware of what lay ahead. I sat down on the bed, letting the memories wash over me, feeling a strange mix of nostalgia and bitterness. I couldn't deny that there had been love there, at least once. We'd built a life together, gone through the trials of raising children, supported each other in ways that now felt hollow but had been real at the time. I wanted to hate every memory, to cast her out of my mind completely. But love and loyalty don't fade as quickly as anger, and I found myself mourning the person I thought she was, the woman I believed in for so many years. But as I turned the pages, the images felt more like someone else's life than my own, a story that had ended long before I'd realized. The final pages were empty, as if the life we'd shared had ended before we even thought to capture more of it. I closed the album, a quiet resolve settling over me. Those memories, once precious, had become something else now. A reminder of how easy it is to believe in an illusion. That night, I boxed up the album along with other keepsakes, deciding they would go into storage. I wasn't ready to throw them away, but I knew I couldn't keep them here, lingering like ghosts in the corners of the house. They were a part of my past, and I was determined to keep moving forward, free from the weight of who she had once been to me. The next day, I took steps to finalize the separation. I called my attorney, discussing the division of assets and the details of how we would part ways. It was a painful conversation, the reality of a divorce that had seemed abstract until now. But each question, each decision brought me closer to a new beginning, a life that I could claim as my own. Through it all, I found a strange strength I hadn't expected. The pain was still there, but it had settled into something manageable, a reminder that I was surviving, that I was choosing myself over the life she had shattered. The sadness, the anger, they were still part of me, but they were no longer in control. As I stood at the doorway of our bedroom, looking at the empty shelves and the bare walls, I felt a strange lightness, a sense of possibility. The life I had known was over, but in its place was something else. An open space, a chance to rebuild on my terms. I knew that there would be hard days ahead, moments when the memories would surface, but I also knew that I was stronger than I had been before. And as I turned out the light, closing the door on the empty room, I felt, for the first time, a glimmer of hope for what lay beyond. After boxing up the memories and finalizing the details with my attorney, I felt a strange mixture of emptiness and relief, like I had purged the last remnants of my old life. I'd expected some kind of peace to settle in, but instead, there was an unease, an echo in the house that seemed to amplify the quiet. Moving forward sounded straightforward in theory, but the reality was far from simple. I found myself filling the silence with activity, anything to keep my mind occupied. Each morning, I'd head out for a long walk, sometimes wandering down paths I hadn't taken in years. The neighborhood, once full of families, had changed too. New people, new houses, all signs of the world moving on, reminding me that I was standing at the edge of something new. Some of the neighbors stopped to talk, asking where Evangeline was or how I was doing, and I gave vague answers, polite but detached. I wasn't ready to share my story, and honestly, I wasn't even sure how I'd begin. One afternoon, during one of these walks, I passed by an old coffee shop we used to go to when the kids were young. It had changed owners a few times since then, but the place still looked the same red and white awning, the same scratched-up tables outside. I almost kept walking, but something about the familiarity pulled me in, as though revisiting a place from our past could help me untangle what was left of those memories. Inside, the warm smell of coffee hit me, and for a moment, I was back in those early days, when life was simpler, when it felt like Evangeline and I were a team. I ordered a coffee and found a seat by the window, watching people pass by outside, letting the memories float to the surface. I remembered us sitting in this very spot, talking about our dreams, our plans, so sure of what we were building together. I wondered if she had ever truly shared those dreams, or if they had just been convenient stepping stones for her to reach a different life. As I sat there watching people come and go, a quiet thought settled over me. It was time to create new routines, new places, new memories that didn't revolve around her. For so many years, I'd been part of something bigger, part of a family, a marriage, a life that had once felt unbreakable. But now, the idea of building something just for myself, no compromises, no deceptions, felt like a gift I hadn't known I needed. I took out my phone and scrolled through the contact list, pausing at the names of friends and family I hadn't reached out to in years. So many of them had faded into the background over time, people I'd neglected while caught up in the whirlwind of my marriage, responsibilities, and family life. I realized then that it was time to reconnect, to rebuild the connections I'd let slip. I started with a simple text to my old friend, Mike, a fishing buddy I hadn't seen in years. The message was brief, casual, but it was a start. And it felt like a step toward reclaiming a part of myself that I'd let go of along the way. Not everything in my life had to be about the past or the hurt that Evangeline had left behind. I still had friends, family, people who had been there long before her, and it was time to return to those roots. As I left the coffee shop that day, I felt a little lighter. The ache was still there, the loss still raw, but there was something else now, too. A quiet optimism, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could build a life that was fully mine. And for the first time, I allowed myself to feel that maybe life beyond betrayal could be not just about survival but about rediscovery, about carving out a new beginning from the rubble. Little by little, I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in ages. Mike and I went fishing one crisp Saturday morning, our rods casting gentle ripples across the lake's glassy surface. He didn't ask about Evangeline, and I was grateful for it. Instead, we fell into the old comfortable rhythm of trading stories, sharing laughs, enjoying the easy silence between us. It was a reminder of the simple joys I'd once let slip away, the moments that didn't need explaining. Over the next few weeks, I started picking up hobbies that had long been neglected, things I'd set aside when life had gotten busy and I'd become absorbed in the routine of marriage and family. I dusted off an old guitar I hadn't touched in years, fingers fumbling at first, but slowly remembering the chords, the way music could fill a room and a soul. Each note felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had been buried, forgotten. One evening, as I was packing up some old boxes in the garage, I came across a set of journals I'd kept in my 20s. I hadn't read them in years, and a wave of nostalgia came over me as I opened the pages, my own handwriting staring back at me, raw and idealistic. I'd written about my dreams, about love, about the kind of life I wanted to build. Reading those words from decades ago was bittersweet. In some ways, I felt like I was reading the thoughts of a stranger, someone who believed in grand ideas, someone who hadn't yet felt the sting of betrayal. But I also saw glimpses of the man I still wanted to be, buried beneath the weight of everything I'd lost. Those pages were a reminder that I didn't have to stay tied to the person I'd become in the last few years. There was a chance to rediscover myself, to become someone stronger, someone whole. With that in mind, I began setting new goals for myself. Nothing dramatic. Just small steps, things I'd put off for years. I'd been talking about taking a road trip up the coast for as long as I could remember, and now, for the first time, it felt like a real possibility. I mapped out a route, noting stops along the way, places I'd always wanted to see but never made the time for. A few days later, I made the arrangements. The thought of setting out on my own, just me and the open road, felt strange but exhilarating. There was no one to check with, no one's schedule to work around. It was a new freedom, and while it felt foreign, it also felt like a long overdue gift. The night before I left, I sat in the living room, looking around at the place that had once been the center of my world. It no longer felt like home, and as I locked up, I felt the last shreds of the past loosen their hold on me. This trip would be a new beginning, a chance to see the world through fresh eyes, and maybe, to find out who I was beyond the roles I'd played. As I pulled out of the driveway at dawn, the horizon stretched before me, open and unknown. The ache of what I'd lost was still there, a quiet reminder, but for the first time, it felt manageable. I was moving forward, towards something that was entirely mine. And with each mile, I felt a little more like myself again. The open road was a kind of freedom I hadn't felt in years. Mile after mile, with nothing but the hum of the engine and the endless stretch of coastline beside me, I felt the weight of everything I'd left behind begin to lift, little by little. The sea was vast and steady, stretching far beyond the limits of my sight, like it could absorb all the bitterness, all the disappointment, and leave me lighter, emptier in a way that was strangely peaceful. As I drove, I stopped in small towns, each one a new start, a place where no one knew my name or my story. I'd pull off at some quiet diner, sit at the counter, and order a coffee, sometimes chatting with the locals, sometimes just observing. I liked the anonymity, the simplicity of blending into places where my past didn't follow me, where I was just another face passing through. One evening, I found myself in a small coastal town just as the sun was setting. The colors stretched out over the water, deep oranges and purples blending into the horizon, painting everything in a quiet, almost sacred glow. I parked the car along the edge of the beach, kicking off my shoes to walk along the shore, feeling the cool sand under my feet. The vastness of the ocean and the open sky made me feel small but in a comforting way, like my problems and my losses were just one small ripple in a much larger world. Standing there, watching the waves crash and recede, I felt a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in months. I realized I was no longer angry, not in the way I had been. The anger had faded, its sharp edges softened, leaving a quiet acceptance in its place. Evangeline's betrayal was still there, still a part of my story, but it no longer defined me. I was more than the man she had left, more than the heartbreak I'd carried. As the days turned into weeks, I let myself sink into the journey, moving without any clear destination, letting each stop, each view, each moment be its own purpose. I'd find little trails off the main road, paths that led to hidden cliffs, quiet overlooks where I could sit and just be. The rhythm of the trip became a kind of meditation, a slow unwinding of everything I'd once held so tightly. One afternoon, I met an older couple at a roadside market. They were friendly, open, eager to share stories of their years together. They asked me where I was from, what brought me there, and before I knew it, I found myself telling them the bare bones of my story. I spoke about the betrayal, the loss, the uncertainty of rebuilding. They listened quietly, nodding, and when I finished, the husband just looked at me and said, "Sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself again." His words stuck with me as I drove on. Losing everything, it was a bitter truth, one I hadn't wanted to face. But maybe, in a strange way, that loss was what had freed me. Without Evangeline, without the weight of my past, I was discovering a version of myself that I hadn't known existed. Each mile felt like a step forward, a shedding of old pain, of the parts of myself that had stayed too long in shadows. I was moving towards something new, something I couldn't yet name but could feel just beyond the horizon. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. I was ready to embrace it. One morning, in a quiet mountain town nestled between tall pines and sharp cliffs, I stopped at a small cabin lodge overlooking a crystal-clear lake. It was the kind of place Evangeline would have turned her nose up at, rustic and unpolished, but something about its simplicity pulled me in. I decided to stay a few nights, craving the stillness and the quiet of the forest. I rented a cabin, no frills, just a bed and a wood stove, the smell of pine filling every corner. The first night, as I sat outside under a sky full of stars, I felt the weight of the solitude settle over me. Not heavy, but grounding. The kind of solitude that brings you back to yourself, stripping away the noise and the clutter. I realized I hadn't felt this close to my own thoughts in years. Evangeline's betrayal had forced me to face parts of myself I'd ignored, and now, with nothing but the stars and the cool night air, I finally felt ready to meet myself fully, without fear or distraction. The next morning, I wandered down to the lake, where a few early risers were casting fishing lines into the still water. I decided to join them, borrowing an old rod from the lodge and finding a quiet spot along the shore. I hadn't fished in years, and as I cast my line, memories of younger days floated back. Long summer afternoons spent with friends, the thrill of the first catch, the sense of accomplishment in something so simple. Hours passed without a single bite, but I didn't mind. There was a patience to fishing that mirrored what I was learning on this journey. A reminder that not everything can be rushed, that sometimes the waiting, the stillness, is where the real healing begins. As the sun rose higher, warming my shoulders, I felt a strange sense of gratitude. Not for what had happened, but for the clarity it had brought. For the first time, I felt thankful that the illusion of my marriage had shattered. It had forced me to see myself clearly, to confront the ways I had let my own happiness slip away, the parts of myself I had sacrificed to keep the peace. I realized, too, that I no longer wanted to return to the life I'd known before. I didn't want the house, the routine, the empty promises. I wanted something different, something built entirely on my terms, no compromises, no pretenses. This journey wasn't just about moving on from Evangeline, it was about stepping into a version of myself that was stronger, more self-assured, someone who could stand alone and be content. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, casting golden light across the lake, I made a decision. I would go back eventually, but not to reclaim my old life. I would return to build a new one, free from the shadows of betrayal, free from the weight of everything I'd lost. I would sell the house, tie up the loose ends, and start fresh somewhere far from the past. Somewhere that held no memories, only the possibility of what could be. By the time I finally pointed my car back toward home, I felt like a different man. The open road had given me time to shed the past, to let go of the bitterness and resentment that had once felt as permanent as the scar tissue over an old wound. Now, I felt lighter, with a new clarity about what mattered and what didn't. I knew going back would mean facing remnants of the life I'd left behind, but I was ready, no longer weighed down by memories I hadn't chosen. When I arrived back in town, I didn't drive straight to the house. Instead, I went to a small hotel nearby, renting a room for the night. I wanted a buffer, a moment to settle in before stepping foot in the place that had been my home. I wasn't sure what I'd feel when I walked through the front door. Anger, sorrow, maybe a mixture of both. But that night in the hotel, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I realized that I felt a strange, quiet acceptance. Whatever had happened, there was part of the past, a story I was ready to close. The next morning, I drove up to the house and stepped inside. Everything was just as I had left it, yet it felt unfamiliar, like a place I'd once known but had grown distant from. I walked through the room slowly, letting myself take in the silence, the emptiness. This was once a house full of life, where every corner held a memory, a piece of the family we'd built. But now it felt like a shell, like the life that had once filled it had faded into dust. I spent the day packing up, clearing out what was left of Evangeline's things, carefully boxing up anything I wanted to keep and setting aside what I would leave behind. I found myself surprisingly detached as I moved through the process, sorting through years of memories, as if they belonged to someone else. I didn't feel the sting of nostalgia or the ache of loss. Instead, I felt a sense of purpose, as if each item I packed up brought me closer to the freedom I'd been searching for. When I finally reached our bedroom, I sat down on the bed, looking around at the familiar walls, the worn furniture, the remnants of a life that had once felt so secure. This room, where I'd once felt safe, was now just another space, stripped of the comfort and warmth it had once held. I could feel the last of my attachment fading, replaced by a strange kind of peace. I wasn't saying goodbye to a person, but to a version of myself that had once lived here, a man who had trusted too deeply, who had built his life around someone who no longer existed. By the end of the day, I had packed up everything I wanted to keep, leaving the house bare, stripped down to its essentials. I contacted a realtor, ready to put it on the market, ready to let go of this last tie to a life that was no longer mine. As I walked through the empty rooms one last time, I felt a sense of finality, a quiet resolve that told me I was making the right choice. When I locked the front door behind me, I didn't look back. There was no need. My life, my future, was ahead of me, somewhere beyond the town, beyond the memories, beyond the betrayal. I was ready to step forward, unburdened, into a life that was wholly, finally my own. A week later, the house was sold. I handed over the keys without a second thought, feeling a sense of freedom I hadn't known I needed. My belongings were tucked into a small storage unit, everything I wanted condensed down to a few boxes and bags, as if the weight of my past could finally be packed away. For the first time in years, I had no roots, no ties to any place or person. My life was mine to shape, to fill with people and places that mattered to me, not out of obligation or habit, but by choice. I rented a modest apartment in a different town, far enough away that I wouldn't run into old faces or familiar reminders. It was a small place, just a bed, a couch, and a view of the mountains in the distance. It was quiet, simple, and somehow it felt right. In the mornings, I'd watch the sunrise from the balcony, sipping coffee as I looked out over the landscape, feeling the peace of a clean slate, a new beginning. Over time, I began to build a life that felt like my own. I took up new hobbies, things I'd never had time for, things that made me feel alive again. I found a local art class, surprising myself with a talent for painting landscapes, a way to capture the open spaces that had brought me so much clarity. I met new people, friends who knew nothing of my past, who saw me only as I was now, unburdened and free. Occasionally, I'd think back to Evangeline, not with anger or regret, but with a sense of distance, like she was a character in a story I'd once known. She had been a part of my life, a part of who I'd become, but she no longer held any power over me. Her choices had set me on this new path, and in a way, I was grateful. Losing her had forced me to find myself, to rediscover the man I'd been before, and the man I was becoming now. One evening, as I watched the sun dip behind the mountains, I felt a calm settle over me, deeper than anything I'd known. The journey had been painful, full of endings and goodbyes, but it had also given me a strength I hadn't known I had. I was no longer defined by betrayal or heartbreak. I was simply me, alive, whole, and finally at peace. And as the last light faded, I realized that this was the beginning I'd been waiting for all along.